the title of this lecture is The Sects of Islam. Even the title of the lecture betrays, well, at least let's say, evokes in me a certain sense of unease. There's a certain way that it's hard, even if I fix a technical term for what is a sect versus, for example, a school, I still have the feeling there's a certain nuance of value judgment that I'm imposing on the material and on the different groupings. I don't, I haven't found an easy way of avoiding this. If I use something more kind of, well, benign sounding like groups of Islam, I'm leaving out at least what can be an important dynamic of the material. So I'm sticking with sects, but I'm going to define it and talk about the different options that I had, and hopefully you'll get a bit of at least a bit of a nuanced view, and won't end up with misrecognition of what I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to communicate. So I think, first of all, the most useful division here for the different groups I'm talking about is school versus sect, or sect and school. I define sect as a group that has very strict boundaries and tends to see themselves as the people of the right, and everyone else in the community as not only wrong-headed, but as dangerous and going to hell. So this is the sectarian impulse. So very strict boundaries, for example, between the in-group and the out-group, or the out-groups. The sectarians tend to give themselves names like the people of truth, and the out-groups, unbelievers, for example. A school, on the other hand, has porous boundaries and has some sense of historical reflexivity. So for example, a school will, be able to describe their doctrines in contrast to the other school's doctrines, and they of course think that they're right. There's a wrong, but there's a certain sense that a certain sense of humility and historical reflection that they know, that other groups are making parallel claims, and they can kind of put themselves in some sort of context, and there tends to be less of a tendency to demonize the others. And the other thing is there tend to be more porous boundaries between members of a school with other groups. So you can be a member of several schools in Islam, you can be a Shafi'i in terms of your legal school, but also belong to a Sufi order for your we're not talking about this course, but you could have different identities, and that's okay. Whereas a sectarian tends to be completely defined by their allegiance to the sect. I put down here some of the Islamic Arabic words that are used within the tradition, just to give you an idea of medieval Muslims and modern Muslims to some extent, their terminology. So you have firqa, and which really just means division, literally, but that is the name of the when medieval Muslims cataloged the different groups as they did in a genre that we've come to translate as we call it heresiography, the study of heresy. It's not a great. It's actually, that comes from the Christian tradition of heresiography, but in truth, the Muslims who are doing it aren't calling all the other groups that are wrong heretical. They're just calling them, on the wrong track, and their group, of course, is the right track. So that would be the word firqa. So it's pretty value neutral, actually. Madhab is the word for school, and I've been using it for the law schools. It's not a school like the University of Oregon. It's a school like the school of Karl Marx, or the school of Adam Smith. In other words, it's the intellectual school, usually identified with a person, but that's the sort of characteristically scholastic as opposed to sectarian, a madhab. And a millah is a Quranic word that came to be used for different communities of believers. So the millah of the Christians, the millah of the Muslims, but it also was used for subsects of Islam sometimes, but usually not. Usually it's for other groups of monotheists. And then these terms on the bottom, ilhad, mulhed, and ghali, are all different words used by the heresiographers, people who really went astray, or groups who really went astray. So ilhad if you commit ilhad and you're a mulhid, you're really a full stop heretic. And the language that they would use for someone like this is that their blood is not protected, or their blood is, in other words, that they're not a protected citizen in the Muslim community, and they're really a persona non grata, and quite dangerous. So that's for ilhad and mulhid. Ghali is a little different. A ghali can be, ghali literally means exaggerator. And by that, and this is the word that Sunnis and certain Shiites use for what they term extremist or exaggerating Shiites, because of their tendency to exaggerate more mainstream theological positions, such as, if the mainstream Shiite theological position or doctrinal position is that Ali was the rightful successor to the Prophet, a ghali will say, well, actually, he was more than that. He was God incarnate, like Jesus. So that's the sort of that's a ghali position, and that is obviously quite extreme. And the group in question may or may not be, mulheads if they follow that, depending on what the doctrine is in question. And there's also historical reasons why some groups are considered heretical and some not by the majority of Muslims. But all of this, I should hasten to add, is kind of ad hoc. There's no official council like you have in Catholicism, for example, like a pope, where there's a sort of declaration made. It's just more individual scholars giving their views and publishing them sometimes in these books of heresiography. So I don't want to overwhelm you, but I did want to give you some overview of the different divisions. And some of them are already familiar with, some of them you're familiar with from my previous talks, or vaguely familiar with. And I'm going to point you to the important parts here. But this is partly historical and partly schematic. So on the top, going top to bottom, on the top we have these Uthmanids and Alids, Shiites in the 660s, right? So remember I said last time, part of the religion and politics come together in the sense that you need to know in this very early period, in the first generation or two after the death of the Prophet, you're expected to know who the rightful imam is and pray behind them in spirit if you're going to get to heaven. And so the Uthmanids pick the offspring of Uthman, the Alids pick the offspring of Ali. And so this is a major division. The group I mentioned very briefly that assassinated Ali, in other words, remember I mentioned very briefly, but I'll repeat it now. There was a group who were followers of Ali. These were Quran reciters who fought with Ali's forces in the first civil war, the first fitna. But when Ali agreed to negotiate with Muawiyah and the forces behind, and the general, one of these former followers was so incensed that they assassinated Ali. And the idea that behind their assassination was that Ali had contravened God's wishes by negotiating rather than letting the battle take its course. There came a sect called that their opponents called the Kharijites, that continued to uphold that belief. In other words, their belief was that God himself should choose the leader of the community basically through the sword. And they had, this is obviously an extremely crude simplification, but the sect continued and lives on into the modern period, interestingly. It's a small group it's a majority in some regions of Oman today. And they've obviously changed their views and had a lot of rationalizing to do. And interestingly, they've been able to make peace, they've been able to sufficiently modernize and kind of rationalize their views so that they're part of the Gulf state community, even though some of the Gulf states are, one would think in terms of ideology would have trouble with a Kharijite political state, but there you have it. So that's the Kharijites. The Murji'ites I mentioned briefly before, they're the ones who said, if you recall, it doesn't matter who the leader is, you're not going to be punished for following the wrong one. And so that's another group. Let's call them a group rather than a sect. And the Kharijites really are a sect, at least they started off that way. Whereas a lot of these other groups are, starting to approach more of the school. And in that would be the proto-Sunnis, the Hadith followers at least, I mean, this sect versus school, a group can go from sect to school and back to sect again, depending on the historical conditions. So in my definition of sect, it's really a kind of impulse and that can kind of take over to demonize the other and say you and only your group are right. And, this ebbs and flows as we see in all times and places. And these exaggerators I mentioned before, the Shiite exaggerators under the Alids who tended to exaggerate according to the more, other medieval Muslims, one position or another. So those groups are just background and not so important for the rest of the talk. But what I'm really focusing on here are the Shiite groups in this talk, and to some degree the Sunnis. So there are three Shiite groups here. You see the Zaydis, the Ismailis, and the Imamis. And those are their both historical and also in terms of their formation, and also their numerical importance, at least in the modern period, but I think in pre-modern also. So the Zaydis being the fewest, the Ismailis being the second, and the Imamis or Twelvers being the most, about 90% of the Shiites are Twelvers today. And the Shiites collectively today, just to give you some frame of reference, are about, it's 15% of the entire Muslim population, which is something like 1.5 billion. So what I like to joke is that, the Fivers are the least populous of the Shiites, but there's still more Fiver Zaydi Shiites in the world today than the entire world Jewry, the entire number of Jews in the world. So in other words, we're talking about very, very well populated. Islam has a lot of followers. It's the second biggest population after Christianity in the world. And so even these subsects that are relatively small still are massive in terms of the number of people identifying with them. Then just to finish the chart here, on the left side you have the Sunnis, and I'm dating them from the year 800, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then the law schools is kind of these divisions, at least of identity, that were important in the Middle Ages and have become less important in the modern period. And now you've got other categories in the modern period, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So let's start with the Sunnis, with Sunnism. So the English Sunnism comes from this expression Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which really you can translate as the people or the advocates of the Sunnah, that is the Sunnah of the Prophet, and that term we've already had with Islamic law, right? The Sunnah being the model of the Prophet. Wal Jama'ah. Jama'ah, you could translate here as community. So the advocates for the model of the Prophet and the community. And this, I think, is the sort of what are the take-home points I want you to hold on to when it comes to Sunnism. The sensibility of the Sunnis is that, in some sense, there's confidence that the model of the right way to behave and what to believe can ultimately be found in the collectivity of the entire Muslim community. And you have traditions like the one I put on the side here. The Prophet said, "My community would never agree on an error," which you can see would be useful for the jurists when it comes to this principle of consensus in Islamic law. So, in other words, the that French motto, 50,000 Frenchmen can't be wrong. I mean, that's sort of that's the impulse of Sunnism. Other features are, of course, the importance of the companions of the Prophet. That is the Prophet's close community members, Abu Bakr, Aisha, Abu Huraira. So this sort of early community and their memories, their transmissions of what the Prophet said and did through hadith, but there's this kind of also that goes with it, this just kind of general sense of these figures becoming the kind of heroes who almost take on the form, not quite, it's controversial, but almost are themselves rightly guided. I don't want to overstate that, but they're certainly heroes. Let's put it that way. I mentioned these two hadith compendiums, collections, Bukhari and Muslim's compendiums, each called the Sahih. So again, these hadith collections are kind of crucial. And then in terms of a sort of single doctrinal ideal or idea that once you have it, you can really talk about Sunnism being kind of up and running, is this idea of the four rightly guided caliphs. So, as you may remember in Watt or in Shepherd, the four right after the death of the Prophet, the first caliph was Abu Bakr, and then Omar, and then Uthman, and then Ali, and these were remembered in the as the four rightly guided caliphs because they knew the prophets personally. Now, this ideal, this concept of there being four rightly guided caliphs, we do not find before the early 9th century, really around 820, 830. Before that, as I said, you either had partisans for Uthman or partisan for Ali. You would never have both on the same list. So this ideal of that there are four rightly guided caliphs and kind of including, let's just say for the people who accept Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman, including Ali on that list, is kind of like the Sunnism's appeal as the big tent tradition. Again, the consensus-minded entire community as far as possible. So you get in Sunnism a sort of pious veneration for family members of the Prophet in a lot of times and places, and one expression that is this four rightly guided caliphs. So if you ever, as soon as you see this list of four rightly guided caliphs as part of it, you've got a Sunni. So just to be clear, I mean, just to restate it because I can't overstate it, Ali is not a bad guy for Sunnis. He's a companion. He's the Prophet's cousin, and moreover, family of the Prophet members are, after all, they are members of the family of the Prophet. So there is a certain there's always a certain respect for that designation. However, the most important, Ali is important as a companion and one of the heroes. That's equally important to his importance as a family member. And along with Abu Bakr and Aisha and the rest. So it's quite a different emphasis. So for Shiism and the Shiites, as you most likely at this point learned in high school or at first reading the newspaper, the defining feature of all Shiites is the belief that the rightful rule lies in the rightful rule of the Muslim community lies in the progeny of the family of the Prophet generally, and for really sort of Shiites proper, from the offspring of Ali, the Prophet's cousin, and Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. So it's this genealogical claim, at the very least, to be the rightful ruler, and there can be claims on top of that in terms of their spiritual importance in their religion, but that's at the very least is to be ruler, the leader of the community. I'm going to talk about the three major divisions of the Shiites. There are, of course, more, but these are by far the most important. Again, the Zaydis, Ismailis, and Imamis. They're sometimes also known by the Imam who, for one reason or another, is either the founder or the sort of breakaway point as defined by, really, yeah, it gets complicated to sort of sort this out, but let's just say they're also known, by the Zayd, for example, being the fifth Imam, counting down after Ali, so they're called fivers. Muhammad ibn Ismail being the seventh Imam, so they're called seveners, and the 12ers having 12 and only 12 Imams, the 12th being the Mahdi, the Messiah, who's currently in hiding. That's where you get the numbers from. But anyway, I'll talk about each in turn now. So the Zaydi Shiites they're named after this fifth, what they count as the fifth Imam, Zayd, the son of Ali, not the Ali. This is the Ali's grandson. So, really, one of the things that I want you to know for each of these three sects is whether they're activist or quietist. And activist meaning, do you take up the sword and revolt against the tyrant who's currently in power, or do you, and quietist being the contrary, you don't get involved in state politics, you wait for, you quietly pray behind the proper Imam, but don't sort of try to put him in power through revolt. So the Zaydis classically, in other words, in most times and places, were activists. That is, the best possible family member of the Prophet should be the Imam, And if one of the ways that the best is defined beyond their scholarly abilities is the capacity to raise a revolt and be successful. So you can't have an imam in principle. He actually has to be in practice the leader of the community. And he does this usually by raising up arms and having a revolt and taking power. And the Zaydis did this successfully in the Caspian region, in Iran for a century and a half. They had a caliphate there, and in Yemen from the early 10th century all the way till 1962, very long reign until the modern republic displaced it. So the Zaydis are unusual in that they accept the fact that you can have more than one caliph at a time. They accept, at least some Zaydis do. So I mean, for a while there were two separate Zaydi caliphates. So it is an unusual, or at least different from the other groups we'll be talking about. Zaydi Shiites there's a certain, I said ambivalence, but really it's more like disagreements and shifts on the status of Abu Bakr and Omar. So the early Zaydis accepted Abu Bakr and Omar not only as companions, but they even accepted them as caliphs, even though Ali was the best candidate. They accepted that, due to confusion, Abu Bakr and Omar took over, and and we accept them. There was then a shift to rejection of Abu Bakr and Omar as caliphs. There was never, and there were times when, like other Shiites, that they were actually, Abu Bakr and Omar were actually cursed as usurpers. But that's not the normal position of Zaydism. The normative moderate position, which is in most times and places, is that Abu Bakr and Omar, in particular, are they weren't the best candidate, the best choice, but rather they were companions of the Prophet, and so you don't curse them. I mean, you accept them at least as companions, if not as caliphs. There is, however, a sort of univocally a rejection of Muawiyah. So Muawiyah, remember, who fought Ali, is universally rejected by the Zaydis as a bad guy, and there can be ritual cursing of Muawiyah. The acceptance of Abu Bakr and Omar importantly led to the acceptance of traditions narrated by all the companions that the Sunnis also take as authoritative. And there really was a shift in the sort of late medieval, early modern periods, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, to go so far as to really push the traditionists and to accept the hadith that the Sunnis accept. And this really brought them into the mainstream and became, Zaydi reformers became quite influential outside of Yemen, among the Sunnis. The classical Zaydis, however, I mean, the sort of old school Zaydi tradition is not so much oriented around traditions of the Prophet, even if they accept them. It's toward this rationalism, Mu'tazilite rationalism in theology and law. And sort of that's the old scholastic, scholasticism that's reflected in old school Zaydism. And there was disagreements among the Zaydi scholars between of these reformers in the 18th century and their focus on hadith over and against the intellect and kalam. So, and I think that's all I want to say about the Zaydis. I mean, I guess the other thing to be said is that currently in Yemen, these are much of the conflict in Yemen stems around. It's so exceedingly sad, complex and terribly sad. But in any case, I'll just say 3 words on it: is that there currently is a civil war in Yemen, essentially between the government that's recognized internationally and that's backed by the Saudis, but is not terribly popular in Yemen, quite frankly. But they're very well funded and they're internationally recognized, and they currently control parts of southern Yemen. And what they mainly have, though, is an incredibly fierce air force, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they've been bombing parts of most of the country in the north, which is controlled by Zaydi militants who've who came down from a region that they've been occupying for the last decade and occupied the capital in Sana'a. So today there's an ongoing, very hot conflict. That's one of the, Syria and Iraq get the attention, and they certainly deserve attention because they're both also probably, in terrible straits. But Yemen's actually much worse, largely due to the character of the bombing campaign, and also a long-standing blockade of food getting into the country by led by the Gulf Cooperation Council. So yeah, so just a quick word, and so it is relevant because it does involve Zaidi politics, and there's a ideological slant that to the conflict. I think it's both geopolitical and sectarian, unfortunately. Yes, so the next group, the Ismaili Shiites, a few things just to say about them. They vacillated, as most of these groups do, between activist and quietist. So they started out very much as an activist group movement, and they were actually successful in founding a caliphate or an imamate. And they're the ones who actually founded. It started in North Africa, but they controlled big chunks of the Islamic world in, the early 10th century, and they're the ones who founded the city of Cairo. So Cairo was an Ismaili Fatimid city. It started out as this a sort of secret revolutionary sect, which is called the Dawa, that spread all over the Islamic world and really threatened not only the Abbasid Caliphate, but also the status of the ulama, the scholars, because the Ismaili Shiite leaders were not classical ulama as we've talked about them. They were more really activist missionaries. And one of the things that they held was this idea that there's a secret sense to the exterior of the law. The batin means the interior or inner or secret sense, and that the imam alone has access to this inner sense, and then you have to get to this batin in order to get salvation. So the imam for the Ismaili Shiites isn't just a political leader. He is the spiritual savior through the distribution, through the dawah hierarchy of this secret sense. And he sometimes is apparent, as in the time when, during the caliphate, and he sometimes is screened and goes into hiding. And this sort of screening versus appearance happens in different historical periods. So, and the Ismaili Shiites have survived on after the end of the caliphate as a school or a sect, depending on the context. They tend to be more quietist, of course. And today, the biggest group is called one way to refer to them is the Aga Khanis, because the Aga Khan, their leader, and he's sort of seen as not only, not their kind of non-state actor imam, but also having special charisma, that is access to divine guidance. And so, and he's very international, lives in Geneva, and visits community members all over the world. And they tend to be more of a modernizing Islamic community that tends to have good relations with the governments of the state they're living in, and that's one of their principles. The third Shiite group is really the group that when people talk about in the news, the Shiites, that's who they're talking about. This is the group that is by far the largest Shiite division. They are a majority of the country in Iraq, and also substantial community in India, Lebanon, India, Pakistan, I should say, Lebanon, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia has got a minority, and elsewhere. Syria is actually another case. There are some Twelver Shiites in Syria, but the vast majority are actually one of the exaggerator groups. That's the Assad regime is from that background, but that's another story. So I'm going to talk about three aspects of the Twelvers, the Twelver doctrine, the Twelver law, and the ethos of the Twelvers. Twelver doctrine first. So first of all, I'm making something that it changes over time and is extremely complex, simple for the sake of clarity. First and foremost, there are 12 and only 12 imams, the 12th of whom is currently in the ghaiba, that is in occultation, in hiding. Um, he is the Mahdi, the rightly guided Redeemer who will come in and usher in the end of days. And he is currently in the mountains of Rauda, in hiding. So and he went into hiding, as I said before, in 872. So obviously, given that, so now 1200 years later, he's still extant according to formal Twelver doctrine. And you get a sense here that we're not talking about ordinary people here with the imams. These are superhuman figures who really in the sources have, similar to the prophet, they're rightly guided, incapable of error. That's what this term esma means. They're incapable of error, impeccable. So they themselves have direct access to divinity or indirect access to divinity through angels. They can read all languages, speak all languages. They know the secret knowledge behind the exterior meaning of both the Quran and all other scriptures. And they really have, in some sources, they're described as having a divine intellect. Their intellect is not like our intellects, and it has access to superhuman divine messages about the secret meaning of the scriptures. So really, the only distinguishing thing between the imam and prophets for the Twelvers is that the imams reveal the hidden meaning and have the full meaning of the scripture rather than bring a new one. But other than that, they, like the prophets, are rightly guided. They themselves are living formulations of both doctrine and practice. So there's a sunnah of the imams, just as there is sunnah of the prophet in a real sense. Other important concepts are walaya, the doctrine that allegiance to the imams, walaya means allegiance to the imams is part of correct belief, and taqiyya, which is this concept that in order to save one's skin, it is permissible to dissimulate out of prudence. Dissimulate is a fancy word for to lie, to deceive. So in other words, if you're in a Sunni sectarian area where Sunnis, you're likely to be endangered. If you reveal that you're a Shiite, you're able to pretend to be a Sunni in order to stay alive. As for Twelver law, which is also known as Ja'fari law after the sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, it's really quite, except for with a few exceptions of which I'll speak, it's very similar to Sunni law. So in substance, there's a huge difference. The difference is actually in the isnads. Whereas in the Sunni isnads, of course, you have the companions of the Prophet. In the 12 isnads, you have the family of the Prophet, the imams and other family members, such as Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, but most importantly, the imams. So it's really the isnads which are different. Other differences are in purity law, in which the 12ers tend to be more strict. The call to prayer is slightly different. The 12ers famously allow for what's known as temporary marriage, that is, marriage for a fixed term for pilgrims intended for pilgrims going on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, so that they can have a temporary marriage and contract for a fixed term. And this was the source of a lot of mockery among critics, Sunni critics, that it's kind of a legalized prostitution. And within 12ers, you also have this traditional, in other words, hadith-oriented versus rational, that is, kalam-oriented and philosophical-oriented divide that you have in Sunnism. So it's interesting. There's some parallels there. And the other thing I'll mention in terms of 12er law is that, once the 12th Imam is gone, in other words, when the imams are around, during the time the imams are living, that is until 872, and that they're extant, they can adjudicate. I mean, you've got basically a rightly guided imam who can tell you, who's got access to the divinity, who can tell you what to do. When they're gone, what do you have? I mean, you're basically left with traditions of the imams and the Prophet. So at that point, mature 12er Shiism starts to look a lot like mature Sunnism, and that both, in terms of law, and that both or depending on the Quran and the Sunnah. The difference being that for Sunnism, it's the Sunnah of the Prophet, and for Shiism, it's the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Imams. I want to talk about a couple of aspects of what I refer to as the Twelvers' ethos. That is, what does it feel like to be a Twelver? First of all, they are really the ultimate of the quietists, historically, classically. That is to say, the sense is that the world is an unjust place, and thus you can't really look to what happens in the history of the world for salvation. You have to look to on the contrary, it's the flip side of the Sunni view of 50,000 Frenchmen can't be wrong. The Twelvers' view is actually, yes, indeed, not only can they usually are wrong. It's the few and the beleaguered and the meek and the minority that usually have the right, and the people who are politically strong have usually gotten so out of because they've acted they've done something wrong to get there. So it's the sort of it's a sense that the historical world is a sad, tragic place, and it's really the next life when things will be corrected, and in the future when the Imam comes. So there's a sense of this redemptive suffering that one builds into the system. In other words, this idea that not only is the wrongful caliph in power, but the rightful Imam, all of the Imams died doctrinally. They were murdered, poisoned. So there's this sense that of really having been wronged as built into the tradition. And I'm going to talk about a couple of ways this is manifest. So one way this is manifest is the so-called Ashura ritual of the massacre of Hussein and his followers at Karbala, the 10th day of Muharram, the month of Muharram. So on this, in this commemoration, the Shiites around the world ritually commemorate the dying of thirst and hunger in the desert and the assassination of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, and his followers at the hands of Yazid, who's cursed ritually. And it is effectively a passion play, and some have noted its similarities to the Christian passion plays. And, of course, classically, Sunnis note that as well and, mock the Shiites of being the kind of Christians of the community. How much overlap and how much borrowing there was is controversial, and there may have been none at all, in fact. But the point I want to get at here is this is a ritual reenactment of this sense of alienation from history. So, as part of this, there's a lot of ritual. I mean, so all of the 11 Imams who've again were murdered unjustly are commemorated each, for the date of their assassination, and if you have the opportunity to spend a year in a country like Iran, you're going to hear a lot of ritual weeping. In other words, this is an example of just a shot of one of these commemoration days where people are, the loudspeakers are blaring out, sort of praise of this fallen hero, and people are weeping over the injustice that's been cast, that has befallen them. So it's sort of again, I guess somewhat similar to Christianity, where one of the main symbols built into the tradition is the crucifixion. So too in Shiism, and Twelver Shiism, is a very central aspect is this sort of is the fact of the historical heroes being wronged. So a couple of, very, very briefly, a couple of important notes on later Twelver history. I said that classically Twelver Shiism are the ultimate quietists, but then you have reality on the ground of a couple of very important moments in Twelver Shiite history where they activate and politically and militarily and change things on the ground. And the first of these that's extremely important, both of them are in Iran. The first are the Safavids, who rose to power in the late 16th, early 17th century, and they were a messianic movement that was Twelver Shiite, and they impose something that's quite rare in Islamic history, which is forced conversion of Sunnis to Twelver Shiism. So under this, in the beginning of the regime, you really had to become a Shiite, and this is the reason why Iran continues to be Shiite until today. So in other words, you have this. It really is quite late to Shias, but there you have it. And the second, of course, that's well known is Khomeini and the rule of the jurist. And Khomeini, who was the spiritual and intellectual source, one of the intellectual sources and political sources of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, held that in the current period we shouldn't just wait for the Imam, the 12th Imam, to reappear. That we need to activate and actually impose a just rule on the earth now through the rule of the jurist. In other words, the ulama should be ruling rather in lieu of the Imam, who is still coming in the future. So here you have, so an Ayatollah is really a very advanced scholar in the Shiite tradition, not necessarily a descendant of the Prophet or someone who is blessed with charisma. And they often are descendants of the Prophet, but they don't have to be. You have examples. I mean, this is just another demonstration of the fact that nothing is really set with these. In other words, you're not limited to what you inherited. You can do something new with it, and these are, this is how history unfolds. People taking the ingredients that came before, recombining it in a new way that serves the ends and is successful, and all of a sudden you have a movement, or a group, let's just say, of the Twelver Shiites who were politically quietists, taking control. So it can happen. So, I would say that for some reason when non-specialists think about regions that are governed by religious sensibilities, or religion is playing a part of the political nomenclature, one tends to overemphasize their fixedness and forget that things can change, that it's always human decisions that are crucial in deciding what happens. So just to close, to talk for a minute about about sectarianism in general, that is the demonizing of the other and the closing ranks. The way that these tend to be treated in the media and as I think that the popular view of it is that during a time of sectarianism, in whatever context, we tend to overstate how intractable the conflicts are, and how important the importance of the content, when in fact, for what it's worth, in my view, if you have the right ingredients in place in any society, these ingredients being scarcity of resources, political vacuum, identity groups of any kind, you're going to have a sectarian milieu. You're going to have a sectarian situation. So the idea that that we now tend to look, sort of in light of the present context, for example, that Sunnis and Shiites are kind of more historically forever at each other's throats, it distorts things. And the same could be said of the situation Israel, Palestine, the idea of Jews and Arabs, whatever conflict, Irish and Catholics in Northern Ireland and in the 90s, it tends to distort the fact that there's political, social, economic factors that are creating a milieu in which these all of a sudden groups which coexisted all of a sudden become these groups become not only politically relevant but seemingly intractable. So that's my take on sectarianism and Islam for what it's worth. Thank you.